heard so much about the significant work and progress that firms in this space have made in the last few months. And it would not be incorrect to say that the government and the policymakers have really supported this growth story. Do you think something is still left for us as a nation to do to come out of this crisis better from a fintech industry standpoint? Or is there something which still keeps you up at night that if this would not happen, then there would be considerable problems?
Say one is the non-personal data governance framework. Looking at it from a compliance perspective, there is a lot that is not clear with it. For instance, what data is within its scope? It's a very ambiguous definition. Anything that is not personal data is non-personal data. So what is within its scope? There is a lot that is unclear. So in terms of a fintech company losing out, being forced to give out information that would normally give it a competitive advantage, that would be a trade secret. How is all this going to be impacted? Second concern I have is with the recent use of Section 69A to block so many apps that happened. This is more in terms of what it indicated, which is as businesses are going digital, the conduct a business entirely can be digital even without a geographic presence in India. And so you see Section 69A, which was actually a content regulation tool if you look into the underlying rules that apply to it. That is being used to, in effect, prevent a business from functioning on account of whatever reasons, privacy concerns, national security concerns. But the thing is, a law that deals with something like this needs to be different. The safeguards needs to be different. Third point would be the recent Google Play Store issue and the competition concerns that emerged. So I think with big tech dominance or even aggregators, so you need to think about stuff like search neutrality and bringing in other such antitrust safeguards, even with the functioning of such entities.
When we talk about anti-competitive activities or actions, allegedly anti-competitive, don't you think that when we look at how the competition is growing in this still nascent industry in India, the same problem some of our own domestic firms might face when they grow to a big tech giant size? Will the same concerns be valid then?
So this isn't an Indian and foreign issue. It is an issue of a dominant player and someone who is new to the field. So even a new person should have an equal playing field. So yes, the same norms should apply whether it's a big tech like Google, which is outside, or even an Indian firm that becomes big. So it's again the way the Competition Commission approaches it. It isn't dominance alone is not a problem. It is abusing the dominant position. That is the main concern that the Competition Commission will
I would
have.
actually agree with what Ashita is saying. It's not about dominancy. There are industries that have a lot of network effect. Right? Industries that have a network effect will tend to have certain players emerge as large in that space or emerge as dominant in that space. It doesn't need to be one, it could be multiple, but there will be certain players who will emerge as more dominant than the others. It is how that dominance plays out. Right? Is that dominance playing out positively by creating more good for the society? Or is that dominance playing out negatively by bringing in practices that are predatory in nature? I think the government has also taken a lot of different steps to create level playing fields. So UPI, for example, is a huge step towards creating a level playing field for a lot of different players. So there are many areas where, by definition or by the nature of the business, dominance is not avoidable. It's how the dominant player conducts himself or herself that really matters.
What, in your opinion would be the right way to deal with these challenges? Because the big tech is likely to remain big for the next foreseeable future.
You need to be very careful about what are the roles and rights that are available. Right? When a big tech starts becoming the judge, jury, and the executioner, it starts becoming a problem. Right? As long as the role is being played in a constructive manner, it is good, and we should encourage that as a society. But we should be careful that we don't fall into the traps of giving too much power in the hands of few and in an unchecked manner. So wherever those kind of issues come in, that is where either as an industry, you need to take a step, or as a government, you look forward towards the government to take a step. I am not an advocate of too much interference in business, but there are areas that require a certain amount of, so to say, guardrails. Right? I would not call them regulations, I would not call them laws, but guardrails which are required in terms of how one needs to conduct uh, himself.
It's a combination of both, like big tech and even if you see aggregators have created a lot of new problems that we weren't aware of traditionally. I think taxi aggregators is something that comes to mind that completely changed the landscape and required a completely new regulation. The traditional regulations did not work for it. So so I think in terms of a solution, one thing is the Competition Commission of India, and also if you look at it around the world, antitrust issues are becoming more and more prominent, particularly with big tech. So I think we do need more solutions, be it in terms of enforcing existing regulation, or if necessary, bringing in new regulation. And like Rohit said, maybe it needs to be more light touch than a very restrictive regulation, so as to not stop innovation. But yeah, to prevent abuse, the focus should be on preventing abuse.
Some scholars are part of a group that still feels that in the Indian financial services industry, we are lagging behind in adopting enabling technologies and enabling environments, be it cybersecurity, be it protecting data, securing data, or proper management of digital identity of users. How big is the problem of fraud, or ensuring that we have the right kind of cyberspace to do all of this in India, especially with digital payments?
I think the importance cannot be overstated. The importance of ensuring data security, ensuring overall IT security is fundamental. Even at Paytm, we run a dedicated setup for IT security. There are several attempts that we fend off because of the IT security practices that we put in place. There are many campaigns that we've run to ensure that customers who may be a bit more susceptible are more educated and informed to ensure that these kind of frauds don't happen. Security and protection of the customers comes fundamentally as a fundamental important piece when we look at the whole puzzle. And that's something that, honestly, when we have discussions, it's one very important aspect that gets discussed when we discuss the design and the journeys and many other things. What I would say is also important as we are looking at this aspect of data security and sensitivity, us being, so Paytm as a brand has participated in various regulated businesses. Right? And by the very nature that we are operating in various regulated, given that we operate in these regulatory spaces, we do take utmost care with respect to data, how it gets used, how that data is secured, how that data is provided, keeping the right kind of Chinese walls between different entities. A lot of that stuff is very important in taking care of. So while I can't speak about the whole industry, but I do see in our discussion with other people and colleagues across the industry that the sensitivity around this, both from a customer and a business perspective, is only going up.
From a payments perspective and specifically a payment aggregator's perspective. So if you look at the new norms, it talks of, it has a number of requirements relating to security. In terms of fraud, so yes, there is the case of user fraud where you need to, or rather fraud that happens at a user level where you need to, like Rohit said, educate the users as to how to be careful. And the RBI has also brought in a number of requirements, whether it's the SMS alerts, whether it's zero liability norms, two-factor authentication. So I think the RBI also recently issued a directive that industries should take more initiatives to educate users. So these are some of the measures happening in the industry. I think in relation to merchant fraud, some changes we'd like to see is more clear reporting requirements and more clear data available to us about the kind of merchant frauds that happen, the mechanisms that are used. To move outside of the payments industry and to the fintech industry in general, or to the tech industry, I think here the lack of a proper enforcing law is a problem, because you currently only have Section 43A of the IT Act, which is rather vague in its scope, not vague in its scope, but very restricted in its application. It only covers sensitive personal data, violation of sensitive personal data, and only if it results in wrongful loss, only then Section 43A comes in to provide compensation to a user. So if you compare that to the Personal Data Protection Bill and the requirements it has in place, where it requires security safeguards, where it requires privacy by design, these are some of the basic concepts under the bill. And then it backs it up with fines of 2 to 4% of a company's annual profits, annual revenue. So this is possibly a method to make sure that companies which are even not bound by sector-specific regulations, that all such companies are compliant and fraud is brought under control. So yes, bringing in a law like the PDP bill, which actually has the teeth to take the necessary action, would be a good step.
Is there anything that you anticipate or envisage in the next few months or year from a regulatory policy making standpoint, which is going to be positive news for the industry and consumers?
So I think a positive news would definitely be DEPA, the Data Empowerment Framework, which has just been announced. So I think in terms of it is meant to, it kind of scales up the account aggregator framework and the sort of the open banking account aggregator enables to other sectors as well. So the scope of that is tremendous. I think in terms of bringing in a larger number of information providers and a greater number of information users. And if you look at it, the as a service services have really exploded today, whether it's lending as a service, banking as a service. I think I've even heard of credit cards as a service. So for all such services to have an open banking structure, and DEPA isn't even just an open banking structure, it goes beyond that. So say even the use of bringing in telecom data into the sector as a means of alternative credit scoring again. So there is a lot that can happen. There is a lot of scope. It does, of course, need to be backed up by proper regulatory frameworks, including the PDP bill. But this is one development that is, in my opinion, extremely promising.
What a credit marketplace can or cannot do. New age credit marketplaces can be a lot more agile, can create a lot of tech very quickly, can enable a lot of stuff, including process efficiency and including risk assessment, quite well, based on which a lender can take an underwriting call. How do we recognize that this is an important part of the ecosystem, and how do we enable and empower that? How do we ensure that under the right kind of frameworks, under the right kind of checks and balances, the intermediaries are also able to access data as a principal and enable the banks to take better calls. So there is a bit of, I would say, that level of clarity which is required. Second, when we're talking about things like lending, right? If a loan is being forwarded, and this is a bit out there, but if a loan is being forwarded to a bank account, is being credited into a bank account, that bank account is already a KYC account. What is the level of audit we need to maintain from a risk perspective versus what is the level of audit we need to maintain or checks that we need to maintain from a KYC perspective become important. And the reason why I talk about this, especially in the context of small businesses. If it's a partnership business, if a bank account is already in the name of the partnership, but to give a loan to that partnership, you still need to go through the entire documentation of a partnership which is not digitally available. Right? Similarly, there's a board resolution which is required for lending to a private limited company. Right? That board resolution today is required on a company letterhead. Is there a way for us to say that it is important as a systemic, to avoid any systemic risk, that there is a confirmation in place with the right authority from the company who's representing that company? But do we really need that to be on a letterhead, or can that be digitally signed? Right. So some of these clarifications in terms of how we move more towards the digital side would help. There are always areas that can further benefit from a relook in terms of what is really the systemic risk that we are trying to avoid, and are there better processes available to avoid that systemic risk rather than going in for physical documentation.
Right. And you think that especially the micro, small and medium enterprises are ready for that kind of change?
See, if you look at it from a small enterprise perspective, let's talk about somebody who runs a small kirana store. Talking about lending, it's easier to lend to that individual in his personal capacity from a documentation perspective. It's more difficult to lend to the business because the moment you are lending to an individual, you need to do an individual KYC. The moment you're lending to the business, you need to do a business KYC, which means you need to then figure out what the business is. You need to figure out what the documentation for that business is. A lot of these people struggle with documentation. Right? So they end up taking individual loans. But can we make it rather simpler for the business? If the loan is being taken by me to run the business, can I make it simple to just take the loan in the name of the business rather than me having to produce 5 different documents to be able to do that, which I may not be able to. And ultimately, I might just take up a personal loan for different reasons. And the personal loan versus a business loan, a personal loan is usually looked at as a consumption loan. And therefore, it will be priced differently compared to a loan that is being looked at as a loan that will create further income and therefore is a different risk compared to a consumption.